Amid the rhythms of modern life endlessly vibrating with invisible noise, our minds often grow weary long before the body has time to notice. Thoughts overlap, unanswered questions linger, and recurring anxieties trace familiar paths, like a satellite that has lost its point of balance and drifts endlessly through space. This video was not created to teach you something new, but to allow you to pause and to step into a slow journey where philosophy and cosmology become a gentle remedy for an overburdened mind. Let your breathing slow. Let the outside world fade like city lights seen from a great distance. In that quiet space, we will together ask a question that seems scientific on the surface, yet reaches deeply into the inner world. How vast is the universe really when compared to our own small galactic home? And when we realize just how small we are within that picture, does it frighten us or does it offer a strange kind of relief? As Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Look at the stars, see their paths. Think constantly on the changes of the elements into each other." Tonight, you do not need to search for answers. Simply listen, and let these reflections gently carry you into sleep, where stillness begins its quiet work of healing. Before any great question is asked, before the mind attempts to grasp or explain, perhaps the most important thing is simply to slow down. Not the kind of slowness that belongs to procrastination, but the slowness of permission. Permission for the breath to settle. Permission for the thoughts crowding your mind to rest for a moment without needing to be resolved. Permission for yourself not to understand anything right away. We live in an age where the mind is rarely allowed to rest. Even when the body lies down, the brain keeps turning, rewinding old conversations, worrying about days that have not yet arrived, and asking questions no one is demanding answers to right now. Perhaps that is why nightfall is no longer a natural silence, but a space where mental exhaustion reveals itself most clearly. In that moment, we realize we do not need more information nor more knowledge, but a different movement of consciousness. A movement that is slow, deep, and gentle. This video was not born to become a lecture. It does not intend to lead you toward a clear conclusion, nor to require you to carry any concepts into tomorrow. It is only a whisper, a soft current of thought placed within the darkness, like a companion sitting beside you, asking very little, simply sharing the open space ahead. And within that space, a question gradually appears, not loudly, not forcefully. It emerges quietly like a faint star at the edge of vision. What if the universe is not infinitely open, but enclosed within a black hole? This is not a question for debate, nor a question meant to prove right or wrong. It is more like a doorway opening onto a different way of seeing reality, and more importantly, our place within it. When we grow accustomed to the idea of an infinite, ever-expanding universe, we unconsciously carry with it a corresponding tension, the need to go farther to understand more, to reach something ahead. But what if the universe is not a boundless space to be conquered, but a closed, profound structure? What if instead of running outward, we are standing inside something vastly greater than ourselves? Philosophy has long whispered this feeling to us, the sense of not being the center, not the supreme subject. Marcus Aurelius once wrote in Meditations, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." These words are not meant to sow pessimism, but to offer finitude as a foundation for calm. When we recognize that we do not hold the entire picture, a strange portion of mental burden begins to fall away. In this way, the question of the universe no longer feels distant from inner life. It becomes a gentle metaphor. A black hole is not merely a physical phenomenon. It is a symbol of the deeper regions of consciousness, where light does not easily reach, where everything is compressed, silent, and difficult to name. Carl Jung once wrote in Psychology and Religion, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Perhaps imagining the universe as a black hole is also a way of learning to remain with darkness, rather than constantly seeking escape from it. On this journey, you do not need to follow every concept. You do not need to picture the precise scale of a galaxy or understand the structure of space-time. All of that can be left behind. What matters more is the feeling that arises when you allow yourself to become smaller, when you release the idea that everything must be clear, must be fully illuminated. When you accept that some questions only need to be asked, not answered. Fyodor Dostoevsky once wrote in The Brothers Karamazov, "The mystery of human existence lies not in just staying alive, but in finding something to live for." And yet perhaps in the night when all goals temporarily dissolve, what we need is not something to live for, but a place to rest within thought. a space where we are not pressured to find meaning, not compelled to become better, deeper, or more intelligent. So consider this opening as a transitional zone. You are leaving behind the daytime with its speed, its harsh light, its endless demands, and stepping into a safe darkness. Here, questions about the universe do not overwhelm you. They soften you. The thought that we exist within something we cannot fully grasp may offer a peculiar relief you no longer need to strain. Nietzsche once wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "When you look long into an abyss, the abyss also looks into you." This line is often read as a warning, but in the quiet space of night, it can also be heard as an invitation to look into depth without fear, because we are not standing at the edge of the abyss, we have always been within it. And if that is so, perhaps there is no need to resist. From here, the journey will continue slowly. Images of the cosmos will appear not as data, but as mist. Ideas will not collide. They will drift past light enough for the mind to hold and then release. You do not need to remember anything. Simply allow this rhythm of narration to replace your usual stream of thought like a new orbit, calmer, more spacious within. If your eyes begin to feel heavy, if awareness starts to blur, that does not mean you are missing something. On the contrary, it may be the moment you are closest to the purpose of this journey stillness. Not an empty stillness, but a full one filled with questions that no longer apply. Pressure thoughts that no longer demand pursuit. And so, before we go any further, remain here a little longer, in this breath, in this darkness, in the sense that you are being held by a space larger than any personal worry. Whether the universe is infinite or enclosed within a black hole right now, only one thing matters. You do not need to go anywhere. You are exactly where you need to be, and sleep may arrive very slowly, very gently, like an answer that requires no words. As the breath has slowed, as the initial question no longer demands an immediate answer, the mind naturally moves into a different region of attention. It is no longer the tension of daytime, nor yet sleep, but a gentle suspension, a place where we can observe without interfering, listen without reacting. It is precisely within this transitional space that very small, very subtle signs begin to feel more noticeable than ever before. For much of modern scientific history, the universe has been described as vast yet fair. Simple laws, balanced probabilities, and a sense that on a sufficiently large scale, everything is neutral and unbiased. In its own way, this idea has offered comfort. If the universe is random, then the uncertainties of personal life carry no special indictment. We suffer not because we are wrong, but because we are only a very small part of a much larger game. And yet sometimes that comfort is gently unsettled, not by a loud discovery, but by a slight misalignment, small enough at first to feel merely confusing, yet significant enough to resist being ignored. Recent observations from the James Webb Space Telescope carry precisely this feeling. Not an immediate revolution, but a thin crack appearing on the surface of a familiar model. When we look deeper into the early universe, into ancient galaxies formed, when everything was still young, something curious begins to emerge. Instead of being distributed entirely at random, the directions of rotation of these galaxies seem to show a slight imbalance, one side appearing more often than the other. Not clear enough to conclude yet, not vague enough to dismiss. Like listening to a lullaby and sensing somewhere beneath the melody, a note slightly out of tune, not breaking the song, but quietly drawing your attention. This sensation is not panic. It is a very subtle unease, the kind that arises only when we are calm enough to notice that what we assumed was obvious may not be entirely true. Perhaps the universe is not as perfectly random as we once believed. And the moment this thought appears, the mind responds in its habitual way, wanting to correct it, explain it quickly, seal the crack with a reassuring hypothesis. But in the space of night, within this slow rhythm of narration, we do not need to do that. We do not need to rush a question into an answer. On the contrary, healing may lie in allowing the question to remain. As Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote in Philosophical Investigations, the problems are solved not by giving new information, but by arranging what we have always known. Sometimes disturbance comes not from learning something new, but from seeing the familiar differently. If the universe truly carries within it a hint of direction of order that is not entirely random, this does not necessarily make it more frightening. It may simply make us feel less alone in the sense that not everything is meaningless, that even at the largest scale there exist small asymmetries, slight imbalances, much like those within the human mind itself. We are rarely perfectly balanced. We lean towards certain memories, certain desires, certain fears, and perhaps this is not a flaw but a sign of life. Carl Jung suggested a similar view when he wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Awareness does not open through smoothness, but through moments of misfit points where the old order no longer fits quite right. The crack in a cosmological model seen this way mirrors a familiar crack in inner life the moment we realize we do not fully understand the world and do not fully understand ourselves. It is important to repeat gently and patiently, this is not yet a conclusion. Science, like a long dream, often self-corrects. Apparent deviations may fade as more data arrives, as perspectives shift, as instruments are refined. And this does not diminish the value of the present moment. On the contrary, it is precisely this state of not knowing that allows imagination and humility to coexist. In personal life, we encounter similar signs. A vague sense that something is off, though not yet clear enough to name. A slight misalignment in relationships and work and how we see ourselves. We often rush to fill these gaps with reasons, plans, or busyness. But night is different. Night allows us to remain with the feeling of uncertainty without shame. Fyodor Dostoevsky once wrote in Notes from Underground, "I swear to you, gentlemen, that to be too conscious is an illness. Perhaps that is why on this journey we do not try to become overly awake. We remain awake only enough to recognize that the universe, like the human being, may carry small biases not as threats, but as reminders that absolute perfection has never been a prerequisite for meaning. When ancient galaxies rotate in ways that are not entirely random, they do not deliver a clear message. They merely whisper the current model is not the whole story. And at night, this whisper carries no pressure. It sounds more like a gentle suggestion you do not need to understand everything right now. You only need to know that there is more than one way of seeing. The transition from the previous part to this one, if you notice, happens naturally. From the question of whether the universe might be closed, we move toward a subtler question. If it is closed, might it carry its own order? And from there, the space of contemplation opens not through explosion, but through quiet observation enough for the mind to drift without grasping. So if at this moment you feel a trace of curiosity mixed with haze, that is entirely fine. If your awareness softens, no longer striving to follow every thought that is even more aligned with the spirit of this journey. The anomalies of the early universe do not ask you to remain fully awake. They simply invite you to stay a little longer within this safe zone of uncertainty. And as you remain there between knowing and not knowing, between science and contemplation, between the universe and the inner world, a different kind of peace begins to appear. Not the peace of answers, but the peace of no longer needing answers. From here, the flow of thought will continue slower and deeper. And if sleep arrives before the journey ends, that does not mean you have missed anything. Perhaps that is precisely how the small universe within you responds to the vast universe beyond, by gently, kindly letting go. As the unusual signs from the early universe continue to hover in the mind, not yet clear enough to be named, not yet strong enough to be dismissed, the current of thought naturally drifts in another direction. Not through a sudden leap, but through a very gentle step backward. As if to understand something vast, we must stop staring directly at it, and instead allow ourselves to see through the assumptions we have grown too accustomed to. If the universe is not entirely random, if there is a faint order hidden beneath the surface, then perhaps the next question is not why, but where are we within that structure? Here, an old hypothesis once set aside at the margins quietly returns, not loudly, not demanding belief, simply present like a distant memory we never truly forgot. That hypothesis suggests our universe may itself be the interior of a black hole. At first glance, the idea sounds paradoxical. A black hole is usually imagined as an ending, a place where everything falls in and never returns. The universe, by contrast, is where everything expands, unfolds, and moves. Yet it is precisely within this opposition that a very particular space for contemplation opens. Not to replace existing models, but to soften them. Try to imagine it not through equations or formulas, but through feeling. A black hole seen from the outside is an absolute boundary. But what if you are not standing outside and have been inside from the beginning? Then the point of no return is no longer a wall, but a contour, an edge so deep you cannot see beyond it, and no longer need to. From this perspective, what science calls the event horizon can be understood as the edge of the observable universe, not the boundary of existence itself, but the limit of what light and therefore consciousness can reach. Everything beyond that edge is not necessarily nothingness. It is simply no longer within the range of our storytelling. This thought carries a strange feeling. It does not overwhelm like the image of an infinite universe. Instead, it feels intimate, enclosed, as if we are living inside a vast room rather than standing in an open field without a horizon. And within that room, life is not a random accident thrown into emptiness, but a natural part of the structure itself. Of course, this is a speculative hypothesis. It is not a verified truth, but that does not render it meaningless. Philosophy has long taught us that some ideas do not exist to be proven, but to change how we stand in the world, as Martin Heidegger once wrote in Being and Time. The most thought-provoking thing is that we are still not thinking. Sometimes what stimulates thought most is not a new answer, but a perspective different enough to interrupt our habitual reflexes. The hypothesis of the universe as a black hole carries that spirit. It does not ask us to believe. It only invites us to remain with the possibility that what we call beginnings and endings may be two faces of the same movement. That the expansion we observe might be the internal experience of a structure that is at another level closed. In inner life, we often encounter such black holes as well, periods that feel constricted, heavy, where familiar meanings seem to disappear. But if we do not see them as points of collapse, and instead as the inner space of a deep transformation, the feeling changes. Fear gives way to a vague kind of waiting, Carl Jung once wrote in the Red Book. In the dark, everything becomes simple. Perhaps this is why the idea of a universe as black hole feels so lullaby-like. It does not demand blinding light. It allows darkness to become a place of dwelling rather than something to be avoided. And within that darkness, life is not devoured, it quietly takes shape. What is worth noting is that this hypothesis does not arise from pure imagination alone. It is inspired by mathematical similarities between the structure of black holes and certain cosmological models. But on tonight's journey, we do not need to enter those details. The goal is not to persuade the intellect, but to soothe it. It is enough to know that this is not a careless thought, but a possibility once taken seriously enough to allow it to remain in the mind a little longer. The transition from the previous part to this one, if you sense it, unfolds like a long exhale. From slight asymmetries in the early universe, we move toward a deeper question: if there is a hidden order, might it belong to a larger structure we are already living within? From there, the idea of the universe as a black hole no longer feels like a logical jump, but a very natural continuation of curiosity that has been softened. Fyodor Dostoevsky once wrote in The Idiot, "The darker the night, the brighter the stars." And yet perhaps at times, comfort does not lie in the stars at all, but in the night itself, a night that does not require us to shine. A closed universe in this sense is not a trap, but a vast embrace. So vast that we cannot sense its edge and therefore do not need to seek an escape. If you feel your mind beginning to drift, no longer gripping each idea that is perfectly fitting, the thoughts here are not meant to be held. They are like dim reflections on the surface of night water, enough to evoke a feeling, not enough to disturb. You may let them come and let them go. Within this hypothesis, there is no promise of certainty, only a gentle invitation to try seeing the world not as a space to be conquered, but as a structure that is holding you. And if that makes you feel safer, even for a moment, then it has fulfilled its role. From here, the journey will continue deeper into questions of beginnings of a bounce instead of an explosion of nested layers of reality. But right now, you do not need to hurry onward. You may remain with this image a little longer, a silent, enclosed universe not meant to imprison, but to allow all movement to unfold naturally within it. And in that feeling, as awareness loosens its grip, sleep may arrive as a gentle consequence. Not because you have understood everything, but because you have stopped trying to understand. And perhaps whether the universe is a black hole or not, that has always been the softest way for a human being to rest. From the image of a closed universe quietly holding every movement within itself, the stream of thought continues, unhurried, undemanding, toward the most familiar story we have ever told about the origin of everything. That story is often given a powerful name: the Big Bang. A moment of eruption, an absolute beginning, a brilliant point where time itself was born. We have grown so accustomed to this image that we rarely pause to ask, is it the only way a story can begin? In the slow breathing of the night, when the mind no longer needs dramatic imagery, we can allow ourselves to look at the Big Bang through a different lens, gentler, deeper. Not to deny what science has built, but to soften the intuition that has long governed our imagination. What if the Big Bang was not an absolute beginning? What if it was not an explosion tearing through nothingness, but the consequence of a contraction so deep it could contract no further? What if instead of a violent outward blast, the universe experienced a bounce, a natural response of structure compressed to its limit. Within the context of the universe, as black hole hypothesis, this idea no longer feels foreign. If our universe exists inside a black hole, then its beginning may not lie in nothingness, but at the critical point of a preceding process. A collapse that did not end in silence, but reversed into motion. A compression so extreme that it gave rise to expansion. Like a breath held too long, finally released not from chaos, but from balance. As this image slowly settles in, it carries a very different feeling from that of an explosion. It is less violent, less abrupt, and strangely more comforting. For if everything began with a bounce, then it implies that before the beginning there was already a process. Before light there was darkness. Before expansion there was contraction. Time then is no longer an arrow shot from nothingness, but a rhythm tightening and loosening, rising and falling. Philosophy has long been familiar with this rhythm. Heraclitus whispered that all things flow, that nothing stands absolutely still. And centuries later, Nietzsche gave voice to the same sense, and thus spoke Zarathustra: all things are in flux, striving toward transformation. If the universe follows such a movement, then the Big Bang is no longer a singular exception, but a phase transition much like those we encounter within inner life. In psychology, we rarely begin from zero. The deepest changes often arrive after periods of contraction crisis or emotional compression. Jung once wrote in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. Awareness, like the universe, does not emerge from comfort, but from encountering limits. And it is precisely at that limit that a bounce becomes possible. What is surprising is that when we view the Big Bang as a bounce, it aligns curiously well with what science observes about cosmic inflation. The extremely rapid expansion in the earliest moments, once puzzling, takes on a different meaning. No longer a gratuitous burst, but the natural response of a structure just released from extreme compression. Like a spring forced too tightly, unable to expand slowly once let go. But on tonight's journey, we do not need to delve into technical detail. Those things can wait for daylight. What matters more is the feeling this perspective brings. If the origin of everything was the result of contraction, then contraction itself is no longer frightening. It becomes an essential part of the cycle. Not a sign of failure, but a condition for renewal. The transition from the previous part to this one, if you sense it, unfolds naturally. From a universe closed like a black hole, we move to the question within that closure: what happened for motion to begin? And the answer, if there is one, lies not in explosion, but in reversal. Fyodor Dostoevsky once wrote in The Brothers Karamazov, the mystery of human existence lies not in just staying alive, but in finding something to live for. Yet perhaps on the cosmic scale, the mystery lies not in beginning, but in continuing. How does everything choose expansion from a state of maximum compression, creating space for structure, for time, for life? This question does not need an immediate answer. It only needs to be held long enough for the mind to stop seeing beginnings as shocks, and instead as gentle movements of necessity. When we allow ourselves to imagine the Big Bang as a bounce, another subtle shift appears. There is no absolute severing between before and after. At a deep level, this can soften the fear of nothingness, the fear that everything might vanish without trace. If the universe began by rebounding from another state, then its end, if there is one, may also be just another phase transition, not a full stop, but a change in rhythm. In the night, when thoughts of endings often unsettle us, this view brings a quiet calm, not because it promises eternity, but because it removes absolutes. No moment is completely detached from the rest of the story. Everything is linked by small movements, sometimes unobservable, yet always present. And if you notice your mind drifting along with these images, a bounce of breath, a released spring, let it drift. You do not need to hold on to any concept. These reflections are not meant to accumulate, but to soften how we think about beginnings, to soften how we think about upheaval, and in turn to soften how we meet the small explosions of personal life moments that seem destructive, yet later open into something new. Nietzsche once wrote in The Gay Science, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." This line is often read as endurance, but in the context of a bounce, it can also be read as a remark on the elasticity of existence. If the universe truly rebounded from maximal compression, then its strength lies not in avoiding limits, but in responding to them with creativity. From here, the current of thought will continue toward ideas of nested universes, of unbroken chains of becoming. But right now, you do not need to go further. You may remain with the sense that beginnings do not have to be loud, that sometimes what gives rise to everything is the deep, compressed silence that comes before. If your eyes grow heavy, if awareness becomes hazy, that does not interrupt this journey. On the contrary, it completes a very natural cycle from contraction to release, from attention to rest. And in that moment, the Big Bang, whether beginning or bounce, no longer feels distant. It becomes a close metaphor for the rhythm of your own life. Each time you let go deeply enough, something new can begin very gently. From the idea of a gentle bounce, where the universe does not explode out of nothingness, but springs forth from a deep contraction, the stream of thought naturally continues to widen. Not widening in the sense of loud expansion, but in the way one dream opens into another layer, resting upon layer with no clear boundary between inside and outside. Once we allow ourselves to imagine that a beginning is not an absolute 0 point, another question, quiet yet deeper, begins to take shape. If a universe can be born from within a black hole, might each black hole be nurturing another universe of its own? Here, imagination is no longer constrained by familiar scales. A black hole, once thought to be the ending of every story, suddenly becomes a doorway of generation. Not in a mythical sense, but as a natural consequence of structure where matter and energy are compressed to their utmost limit, something new is compelled to occur. And in some speculative models, that something may be the birth of a child universe. This image is often compared to Russian nesting dolls. Open one layer and another appears within. Universes giving rise to universes, black holes, carrying the seeds of new space-time, each layer existing fully within its own frame of reference. No layer is smaller in an intrinsic sense. They are simply invisible to one another from the outside. What is striking is this: once we accept this possibility, the concept of scale begins to lose its absoluteness. The largest can contain the smallest, and the smallest from within can feel infinite. This is not foreign to human experience. A single thought can contain an entire inner life. A small memory can open into a whole universe of feeling, and a brief dream can carry the depth of many waking years. Philosophy has long been suspicious of perfectly closed systems. Spinoza wrote in Ethics, "Whatever is in God, and nothing can be or be conceived without God." Though the language is theological, the core intuition remains: existence always rests within something larger than itself. If we replace God with structure or totality, the feeling still holds. Everything is held not to be controlled, but to have a place in which to exist. Within the hypothesis of nested universes, there is no absolute center, no confirmed final universe, only a potential chain of generation, each black hole a threshold, each threshold a possibility. And here, what matters is not whether this chain is literally real, but the inner experience it offers. For when we stop searching for a definitive endpoint, the mind begins to relax in a different way. There is no longer a need to know where the bottom is, no longer a need to reach the final layer of reality. Perhaps as Ludwig Wittgenstein suggested in Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. What lies beyond our capacity to describe does not cease to exist. It simply does not need to be spoken of right now. In inner life, we often become trapped in the desire to find a final cause for every feeling. Why am I sad? Why am I tired? Why does this worry keep returning? But sometimes, tracing everything back to an ultimate origin does not bring relief. It only tightens the strain. The idea of nested universes offers another option. Not every chain needs an endpoint in order to have meaning. Carl Jung wrote in Man and His Symbols, "Man uses the spoken or written word to express the meaning of what he wants to convey. But not all meaning needs to be fully articulated. Some structures can only be felt, not said. And the chain of universes giving birth to universes may belong to this category, an image for contemplation, not for hurried verification." The transition from the previous part to this one, if you notice, it unfolds quite naturally. From the bounce that gives rise to a universe, we move to the question: if one bounce is enough to create a world, why could it not happen again? And from there, the scale of contemplation opens, not horizontally, but in depth, layer within layer, without competition, without exclusion. Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote in The Brothers Karamazov, "I think the devil doesn't exist, but man has created him." In the context of nested universes, this line can be read as a reminder. Human beings often create fear when they force reality into overly simple structures. The idea of an infinite chain unsettles us because we fear losing control. But if control is no longer required, the chain becomes gentle. Try to feel this image as a lullaby, like motion. One universe quietly forming within another. No explosion, no blinding light. Just a natural continuation, like one heartbeat following another, like one sleep flowing into the next. There is no need to know how long this chain extends, no need to know whether it has an end, for in this moment you are not standing outside the chain observing it, you are inside it. And if that is so, the question, where does this chain end, no longer feels threatening. It becomes an open question, like asking, where does a dream go when we fall more deeply asleep? The answer is not required. Letting go is what matters. Nietzsche wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster." Perhaps on tonight's journey, the monster is not infinity, but the obsession with ending everything in a clear answer. When we stop fighting ambiguity, we do not lose reason. We simply allow it to rest. Nested universes, in this sense, are not a theory to be believed. They are a mental space in which to set down the burden of finality, a way of accepting that some of the most beautiful questions remain open, and that not every journey requires a final destination in order to matter. If at this moment your awareness begins to blur, if the layered images in your mind dissolve into one another, that does not diminish the meaning of this passage. On the contrary, it completes a very natural cycle from expanding contemplation to rest. You do not need to carry any image into sleep. You only need to carry the feeling of being held, as if no matter how long the chain of universes may be, right now, you are lying quietly within a very safe layer of it. And within that safety, sleep may arrive not as an ending, but as another layer gently closing, allowing a deeper inner space to continue opening very slowly, very kindly. From the image of universes nested within one another, each layer opening into the next with no absolute center and no final edge, the stream of thought gradually drifts toward a more intimate question. One scale has expanded beyond the mind's need to grasp what naturally remains is life. Not life in the abstract, but life with memory, with choice, with the capacity to build and to depart. In other words, civilization. If each black hole can be the cradle of a new universe, then civilizations that endure long enough, that grow subtle enough, may eventually come to recognize this as well. Unlike the familiar heroic narratives where intelligence conquers space through power or ambition, this possibility carries a very different tone. It is not loud. It does not boast. It feels more like a quiet turn than a victory. Imagine a civilization that has traveled very far along the path of understanding. It is no longer obsessed with expanding territory, broadcasting signals, or leaving marks behind. Having looked deeply enough into the structure of reality, perhaps it realizes that what matters is not remaining but entering. Not moving outward into the universe, but inward into its depths, where a black hole is no longer a threat, but a doorway. Seen this way, the silence of the universe offers a different kind of answer. Instead of assuming that we are alone or that other civilizations destroyed themselves in tragedy, we can consider a quieter possibility they chose to leave, not to escape, not out of despair, but because they discovered another path more discreet, more fitting for a mature stage of consciousness. That silence viewed from a distance no longer feels frightening. It resembles a room that has been tidied, lights dimmed, footsteps fading away. No smoke, no ruins, just an intentional absence. And within that absence, a deeply human quality begins to appear, the ability to know when it is time to step off the stage. Albert Camus once wrote in The Myth of Sisyphus, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart." Yet perhaps at some point, struggle is no longer required to fill the heart. There may come a time when consciousness chooses a form of existence no longer based on asserting itself, a movement inward rather than forward. In personal life, we experience departures like this as well. Not every farewell is a failure. Not every silence is empty. Sometimes leaving a familiar space is a sign of ripeness. We no longer need to be seen, no longer need validation, no longer need to tell our story to everyone. We choose quiet, not from fear, but from sufficiency. Friedrich Nietzsche suggested a similar movement in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. But perhaps after the star has been born, after the light has spread, what follows is not more chaos, but a settling. A civilization, like a person, cannot remain forever at the peak of expression. There comes a moment when discretion itself becomes a form of intelligence. The transition from the previous part to this one unfolds naturally. From nested universes, we arrive at the question, who has passed through these layers before us? And when there are no signals, no calls, we learn to read silence as a different kind of message. Not there is no one, but they are no longer here. Carl Jung once wrote in Psychological Types, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself." Yet in this context, the silence of the universe need not be loneliness. It may be the result of no longer needing to communicate in the old ways. When consciousness changes, language changes with it. And perhaps civilizations have chosen modes of existence beyond our capacity to hear. What is striking is that in this hypothesis there is no tragedy, no cosmic disaster, no interstellar war, no fiery apocalypse. Only decision. A quiet decision, personal and collective, made when conditions have ripened. Like turning off the light before sleep, not because the room is collapsing, but because light is no longer needed. Fyodor Dostoevsky once wrote in "The Idiot Beauty Will Save the World." Perhaps the beauty that saves here is not radiant display, but the ability to disappear without causing harm. A civilization beautiful enough to leave without leaving fear behind. Only a silent sky wide enough for those who come later to place their own questions beneath it. And in this moment, as you listen, the story of civilization and disappearance no longer feels distant. It reflects a deeply human longing to rest from presence, to stop performing, to stop proving, to stop broadcasting signals endlessly into the void. At night, this longing becomes clearer, like a whisper reminding you that you do not need to be everywhere in order to matter. The silence of the universe in this sense becomes a gentle mirror. It asks, are there parts of your own life that are waiting to be left quietly? No conclusion is required, no drama, just a laying down. Hannah Arendt once wrote in The Human Condition, "The most radical revolutionary will become a conservative the day after the revolution." Perhaps after every intellectual revolution, what human beings and civilizations seek is no longer change, but inner stability, a form of existence that does not need to prove itself as the center of the universe. From here, the current of thought will continue toward questions of fine-tuning of chance or necessity, in the constants of nature of whether life is designed or not. But right now, you do not need to go on. You may stay with this image a little longer, a quiet universe where those who came before left no loud traces, only a space safe enough for new dreams to form. If your eyelids grow heavy, if awareness slowly drifts away from each sentence, this does not leave the story unfinished. It completes a very natural cycle from expansion to stillness, from curiosity to release. And within that release, sleep may arrive as a deeply civilized act, not tragic, not heroic, but simply a gentle choice to step away. After the silence of civilizations that chose to depart, the current of thought naturally slows for a moment and then touches something even deeper. No longer the question of who was here or where they went, but a subtler, slower, and more unsettling wonder. Why was life able to appear at all? Among all the possible forms reality might have taken, why do the physical constants fall within such a narrow range, just enough for atoms to form, for stars to burn steadily, for planets to endure, and for life to have time to take root? A very slight change and everything could have collapsed before it ever began. In science, this question is often called fine-tuning, but at night, without terminology, it appears as a feeling everything seems improbably well-fitted. This feeling is not loud. It does not force belief in any particular answer. It simply gives rise to a gentle hesitation, like stepping into a room arranged with uncanny precision and quietly wondering whether someone intended it that way. Not to accuse, but to linger in attention. If each black hole can give birth to a child universe as we have imagined, then the question of fine-tuning opens yet another layer. Are all those universes alike, or is each one born with slightly different constants, a little stronger, a little weaker, slightly askew, with only a few gentle enough to allow life to exist? In that case, there is no need to assume design. We are simply the survivors in a sea of possibilities. Yet even this explanation does not close the question. For if there are countless universes, why does the mechanism that creates them exist in precisely this way? Why does the overall structure allow such diversity at all? When pushed further, the question does not vanish, it merely changes shape. Here, philosophy does not rush to take sides. It does not need to declare everything necessary, nor insist everything is intentional. It simply invites us to remain suspended between the two. As Blaise Pascal once wrote in Pensées, "The eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me. The silence of infinite space is unsettling not only because it is vast, but because it does not answer. And it is precisely this lack of answer that turns human beings inward toward listening. When we allow ourselves to feel the fine-tuning question as an inner experience, it begins to mirror something deeply familiar. In personal life, we often wonder, why am I here in these circumstances with conditions just sufficient to exist? Born slightly earlier or later in a different place into a different family, we would be someone else entirely. Personal life, like the universe, bears the mark of a fragile just enoughness. Carl Jung once wrote in Psychology and Alchemy, "In all chaos, there is a cosmos in all disorder, a secret order." This does not assert that such order is designed by an external will. It suggests only that meaning does not always arise from intention, but can emerge from complexity itself. When we look long enough, deeply enough, what appears random may begin to reveal a rhythm not to be explained, but to be felt. The transition from the previous part to this one is very gentle. From the silence of the universe where civilizations have chosen to leave, we step into another silence more subtle still, the silence of origins. No stories, no traces, only numbers, initial conditions, and the strange presence of life amid all the possibilities of non-life. The question, necessity, or intention thus ceases to be a problem demanding a solution. It becomes a frame for contemplation. If everything is necessary, then life is a natural consequence of structure, and we need not carry the burden of being chosen. If everything is intentional, then life carries symbolic value not for pride, but for care. Yet perhaps the most healing possibility lies here: we do not need to choose between the two. Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote in Culture and Value, "It is not how things are in the world that is mystical, but that it exists. The mystery lies not in how the universe operates, but in the fact that it is. And so it is with human beings. What is profound is not what purpose we have, but that we are here, able to feel, to reflect, and to listen in the night. When we stop trying to lock the fine-tuning question into a conclusion, the mind begins to soften. There is no longer pressure to prove that life has objective meaning. No longer the fear that if everything is random, we are therefore meaningless. Instead, another feeling emerges. Meaning may be something that arises, not something bestowed. In sleep, your body does not need to know why cells know how to repair themselves, why the heart keeps its rhythm. Everything unfolds in a quiet sufficiency. And perhaps the universe is the same, a system balancing itself, requiring no final explanation in order to continue. Soren Kierkegaard once wrote in concluding unscientific postscript, "Life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced." Placed beside the fine-tuning question, these words become unexpectedly gentle. The universe is not a puzzle to be conquered. It is a reality to be lived with. And at night, when goals fall away, that being with becomes more natural than ever. If the universes within black holes are not identical, if each structure carries its own conditions, then our presence in one that allows life need not carry metaphysical weight. It needs only existential meaning. We are alive, and that is enough for this moment. No extrapolation required, no justification. And if, on the other hand, we are living within a structure that is designed whether by law, by necessity, or by something beyond language, the gentleness remains. For design in this view is not for judgment, but for permission. Permission to exist, permission to vary, permission to rest. And so this reflection does not close with a conclusion. It deliberately leaves the question suspended like a star that needs no name. You do not need to carry it with you. You may let it drift like the final breath before sinking more deeply into sleep. If your eyelids have grown heavy, if concepts begin dissolving into sensation, this does not diminish the journey. On the contrary, it returns you to the proper place of the fine-tuning question, not in the mind, but in quiet presence. And in that quiet, whether the universe is necessary or intentional, whether life is outcome or purpose, what matters most right now is simply this: you are allowed to exist without an answer. And with that gentle permission, sleep may arrive slow, warm, and whole. After the question of fine-tuning is left suspended, neither closed nor explained, the current of thought naturally slows by another measure. As if the very act of not concluding has opened a new space, one in which the mind can rest from the pressure of being right. And within that space, a very important attitude, often misunderstood, begins to emerge: doubt. Not a harsh doubt nor a destructive skepticism, but a form of intellectual humility soft enough not to trap itself inside provisional certainties. In the popular imagination, science is often seen as a path toward final truth, but those who live within science understand it differently. Science is not a collection of immutable claims. It is a long sequence of revisions, a map constantly redrawn as we realize we have misread the terrain. When science is seen this way, doubt is no longer an enemy, it becomes the engine. Within the context of the large ideas we have just passed through, the universe as a black hole, The bounce instead of the bang-nested universes, the fine-tuning question, this attitude of doubt becomes especially important. For all these images rest upon observation, and observation is always limited. We look at the universe through instruments designed by human beings using models built from the very narrow experience of a species living on a small planet. This does not weaken science. On the contrary, it makes it honest. Honest about the possibility of error. Honest about the fact that every piece of data passes through a layer of interpretation. Honest about the reality that what we call understanding today may be only a temporary version of a much longer story. At night, when there is no need to defend a position, we can allow ourselves to feel this without anxiety. We can admit perhaps the anomalies we observe are merely measurement errors. Perhaps those asymmetries will vanish when the data grows large enough. Perhaps the universe does not rotate. Perhaps there was no bounce. Perhaps there are no child universes at all. And that does not undo this journey. Because the purpose of this journey is not to prove a theory, but to place the mind in a fitting state, a state of openness without defense. A state Karl Popper once described succinctly when he wrote, "Our knowledge can only be finite, while our ignorance must necessarily be infinite." The finiteness of understanding is not a failure. It is the condition that allows learning to continue. Measurement bias does not exist only in cosmology. It is deeply familiar in inner life. We measure ourselves with imperfect instrument success, comparison, selective memory. We view the past through the lens of the present, and the present through the fears of the future. We believe we know ourselves well, when in truth we are only familiar with a few recurring versions of who we are. David Hume warned of this confidence in an enquiry concerning human understanding. Custom, then, is the great guide of human life. We believe something not because it is absolutely true, but because we have grown accustomed to believing it. And it is this familiarity that creates the illusion of certainty. In science, as in life, doubt is the only way to loosen that illusion, not to fall into chaos, but to become more flexible. The transition from the previous part to this one unfolds naturally. From the question necessity or intention, we move toward a quieter inquiry. Could the very way we frame our questions be leading us astray? And when we accept this possibility, inner space suddenly widens. There is no longer a need to choose sides. No longer a need to defend a particular image of the world. We only need to remain with a more original curiosity, one that does not demand immediate answers. In the history of science, the greatest advances often came from recognizing error. Models once held with absolute confidence were replaced not because they were foolish, but because they were incomplete. And in personal life, we mature not by always being right, but by gradually realizing where we have misunderstood others, the world, ourselves. Soren Kierkegaard once wrote in The Concept of Anxiety, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. Doubt at a deeper level carries a similar feeling. When we realize that every model may be revised, we feel dizzy with that freedom. But if we do not rush to fill it with new certainties, the dizziness slowly turns into relief. We are no longer bound to the task of holding truth tightly. In the context of sleep, this has particular value. Many people lose sleep not because they lack answers, but because they possess too many certainties. Rigid conclusions about themselves, about life, about the future, repeating in the mind, like laws that cannot be amended. When we learn to doubt those conclusions, not by arguing with them, but by softening around them, the mind begins to release. Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote in Philosophical Investigations, "Doubt is not the opposite of certainty, it is a component of it. Healthy certainty does not exclude doubt, it includes it. And at night, when the goal is not action but rest, doubt can become a soft pillow supporting the mind, so it no longer has to stand upright at all times. If our observations of the universe are mistaken, that does not make the universe smaller. It simply makes us more humble in how we tell its story. And if the stories we tell about ourselves also need revision, that does not diminish our worth. It only shows that we are still alive, still changing, still unfinished." Intellectual humility in this sense is not weakness. It is a form of deep rest. Rest from having to defend the image of being the one who knows. Rest from needing a clear stance on every question. Rest from having to be certain about tomorrow before being allowed to sleep. And so in this journey, doubt is not introduced to dismantle the ideas we have built. It arrives only to soften them, to remove their sharp edges, to free you from carrying them further. You may set them down like a book left unfinished beside the bed, not because it lacks value, but because you do not need it right now. If at this moment your thoughts begin to drift beyond control, blending into one another, losing clear boundaries that is perfectly in tune with the spirit of this part. Science moves forward by correcting itself. The resting mind does the same by allowing itself to be not right for a while. And within that permission, sleep can arrive quite naturally. Not as an escape from questions, but as a quiet trust that the questions will still be there tomorrow. Gentler, clearer, or perhaps no longer necessary at all. After doubt has been set down like a heavy coat, the mind enters another region of calm, no longer striving to verify, no longer pressing to understand. At the edge of this state, the story slowly draws toward its close with an image that is very distant, very slow, and yet very near a black hole evaporating. In science, the idea that black holes do not exist forever was once difficult to accept. They stood as symbols of absoluteness, of no escape of eternity. And yet, from the most modest calculations, it emerged that black holes, too, may gradually fade little by little, like everything else in the universe. They do not explode. They do not collapse. They simply dissipate very slowly over spans of time so vast they are almost beyond imagination. And here in the space of night, the question is no longer whether this is true or false. The question becomes a whisper: if a black hole evaporates, what happens to the universe that lies within it? This question does not demand an answer. It moves through awareness like a soft breeze enough to make us pause enough to let all previous thoughts settle. If our universe truly exists inside a black hole, and if that black hole is not eternal, then perhaps this entire reality is also temporary. Not fragile in the sense of easily broken, but temporary in the sense that it does not need to last forever to hold value. At first, this thought may bring unease, but if we remain with it long enough, another feeling slowly emerges, a very quiet one. For if everything is temporary, there is no pressure to be perfect, no demand to complete everything, no obligation to understand it all before being allowed to rest. Philosophy touched this feeling long ago. Marcus Aurelius once wrote in Meditations, "All is ephemeral fame, and the famous as well." Not to diminish the value of life, but to place it within the proper rhythm of time. If the universe too is temporary, then it no longer stands above humanity as a cold, immutable structure. It becomes a process in motion, much like our own breathing in the night. The transition from the previous part to this one is almost imperceptible. From scientific doubt, where every model may be revised, we step into an even softer space, one that no longer requires models at all. Only an image remains. A black hole that is no longer a terrifying mouth, but a span of time slowly closing. And within that closing rhythm, the question of ending loses its tragic tone. If a universe can fade, that does not mean it has failed. It simply shows that existence does not need to be eternal in order to have depth. Like a nocturnal melody, its value lies in being heard, not in lasting without end. Martin Heidegger once wrote, "In being and time, being toward death is the anticipation of a possibility." An ending in this view is not the negation of existence, but a possibility that is always present, giving shape to each moment. If the universe too is oriented toward an end, then it carries an existential quality, one not as foreign to us as we might have believed. When we ask whether all universes are temporary, we are not seeking a verdict. We are touching a very gentle truth. Every form has its own rhythm. Some endure for long spans, others briefly. Some last billions of years, others only a night. And within their own rhythms, each is complete in its own way. Carl Jung once wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, "Life has always seemed to me like a plant that lives on its rhizome. Life does not need to display its entire cycle on the surface. Much of it unfolds in darkness unseen. And if the universe too has phases of quiet dissolution that does not strip meaning from what has unfolded within it, here what matters is no longer the answer. Not whether the universe ends, not how black holes evaporate. What matters is the feeling that begins to spread when we allow such questions to remain without solutions. The feeling of living within a reality deeper than what daytime senses permit us to see. Deeper than expansion or contraction. Deeper than beginnings or endings. Fyodor Dostoevsky once wrote in The Brothers Karamazov, "The mystery of human existence lies not in just staying alive, but in finding something to live for." But at night, when goals no longer press, that something to live for may be very simple to feel that depth even for a brief hazy moment before sleep. When a black hole evaporates, it does not vanish at once. It fades, and perhaps sleep arrives in the same way. Not through a sudden fall, but through a gentle withdrawal of awareness. Words begin to blur. Images dissolve into one another. The boundary between the outer universe and the inner one grows indistinct. Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote in Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. But the silence here is not a prohibition, it is an invitation to rest within what cannot be said, to feel that not everything must be articulated in order to exist. If the universe is temporary, then your sleep is also a form of temporariness, a small pause within the stream of consciousness. Not an escape from reality, but a return to its depth, a place without audience, without questions to answer, without models to correct. And so this ending does not conclude with a summary. It simply opens a space in which you may release every idea about black holes, about the universe, about life itself. You do not need to carry anything further. What needed to be felt has already been felt. It does not need to be held. If your eyelids are heavy, if your breathing has grown even, that does not leave the story unfinished. It fulfills its purpose. For in this moment, whether black holes evaporate or not, whether the universe is temporary or eternal, the one certainty that remains is this: you are within a reality deeper than you once imagined, and you are allowed to rest inside it. And with that gentle permission, silence may arrive, not as emptiness, but as a final fullness. And when the story reaches the edge of silence, where images of the universe, black holes, beginnings, and dissolution slowly fade, what remains is not a conclusion, but a pause wide enough that you no longer need to carry any questions with you. Not because they have been answered, but because for now they are no longer necessary. You do not need to remember the concepts you have passed through. You do not need to hold on to any image of cosmic structures or the hypotheses that were shared. All of them have completed their task. They guided you away from the rhythm of the day and brought you closer to the rhythm of your own breathing. Now you may let them drift away like clouds dissolving into the dark. At this point, philosophy is no longer a system of thought. It returns to its most original form, listening to the body as it grows heavy, listening to the heartbeat slowing, listening to the quiet space between two breaths. As Epictetus once wrote in Enchiridion, don't explain your philosophy, embody it. And now that embodiment lies not in action, but in release. There is a very particular moment before sleep when the mind stops trying to connect everything into a coherent story. In that moment, memory softens, thoughts loosen. And this is not a sign of losing control, but a sign of safety. Safe enough not to understand more. Safe enough not to remain vigilant. The transition from the previous part to this one is almost imperceptible. From recognizing that everything is temporary, we arrive at a very simple realization. Even this state of wakefulness does not need to last. You do not need to remain in the role of listener. You do not need to keep following this voice. You may let it become background like distant wind, like very light rain. Marcus Aurelius once wrote in Meditations, "Know where you can go is more peaceful, more free of interruptions than your own soul." And to enter that peace, you do not need to do anything at all. No effort, no imagining, only permission. Permission for the eyelids to close. Permission for thoughts to pass without being followed. Permission for sleep to arrive when it wishes. If a question still echoes, however faint, you do not need to push it away. You also do not need to answer it. You may set it down like placing a light object beside the bed with the thought, "I can return to this another time." Sleep does not ask you to complete anything. It simply invites you to rest within what is unfinished. Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote in Culture and Value, "I am not a religious man, but I cannot help seeing every problem from a religious point of view." Perhaps sleep carries a similar quality, belonging neither to logic nor explanation, but to a very primitive trust, the trust that you can let go without disappearing, the trust that the world will still be there in the morning, the trust that you do not need to control everything in order to be safe. You have gone far enough for tonight. Not in distance, but in letting go. The deeper reflections have softened the sharp edges of a long day. The larger questions have done their work by carrying you away from familiar noise. Now they may withdraw quietly, politely. If you notice that you are no longer following each sentence that is perfectly fine, there is nothing left to follow. As Seneca once reminded in Letters from a Stoic, sometimes even to live is an act of courage, but at night sometimes sleeping is an act of courage too. The courage to do nothing more, to think nothing more, to try nothing more. Let lightness be the only thing you carry with you. Not understanding, not information. Just the feeling that you are allowed to stop. The feeling that you are not falling behind by no longer thinking. the feeling that in this moment simply existing is enough. Sleep does not need to be summoned. It comes when you stop waiting for it, and whether it comes now or a little later does not matter. There is no goal to reach, no process to complete. Everything can be left for tomorrow. And so this closing does not end with a farewell or a reminder. It simply opens a very small door just wide enough for you to pass through without noticing. On the other side, no questions are waiting. Only rest. Only gentle darkness. Only sleep finishing what remains. You do not need to carry this story any further. You may leave it behind. Very slowly, very quietly.